welcome to Where's My Village? Strategies for Easing Parental Loneliness, Guilt, and Stress. We wanted to start, we're really lucky enough to be hosting this with Nara Organics today. And so we're really excited. We wanted to give you a little bit of background on sort of maybe how you got here and what Cooper is about. So Erin and I are both here today on behalf of Cooper, who's hosting this event. And we are Parenting Groups Reimagined. So we are small groups of parents, 10 to 12 parents who meet monthly around psychoeducation, talking about the ways in which children develop, what we know from the research, and then practical strategies we can use based on that research for how to handle the everyday challenges that our children give us and the joys and ups, downs, and everything in betweens of parenting. We also get to host assemblies like this one. We have office hours, we have newsletters, we have lots of information specifically to support you in your most important role, or at least your most demanding role as a parent. And so we're thrilled to be able to do things like this where we bring our expertise or other experts in the field together to be able to talk. So we're happy to answer any questions about Cooper when we get to the end. But for now, we're going to jump into loneliness, which sounds like a phrase that doesn't roll off the tongue. As a quick introduction, I'm Marielle Benjamin. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm the director of groups at Cooper. I am here in sunny Los Angeles. Today it's sunny. It hasn't been sunny, but today it's super sunny. And mom to Madeline, Lucas, and my puppy, Milo. So I always say I had the dog after the kids in the other order. And so I appreciate the dog really as my third child because he's not my first and he seems much easier than the other two. So that's me. Erin, can I pass to you?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you all for joining. This is a topic that I know is very near and dear to all of our hearts. I am a developmental psychologist by training. I'm also a professor at New York University where I direct the early childhood program and have a research lab that's following children and their parents from when the children were 4 years old until now they are 22. So we're looking at all these different factors that really come into play when you're thinking about parenting and child development, which is exciting, as well as the chief of education here at Cooper. And in terms of my quote unquote professional life, I'm also the mom to two daughters, one who is 2 and the other is 14, and someone who experienced a lot of loneliness themselves at both parenting transition points. So really excited to be able to speak with everyone today about this important topic.
Yay. And Esther?
Hi, my name is Esther. I'm the founder and CEO of Nara Organics. Thank you to Cooper for having me here today. I am mom of Nara, who's now 6 years old. I named my company after her. At Nara Organics, we make organic infant formula. We're trying to create a world where parents can choose a baby formula with confidence and ease. And we're here to bring impeccable nutrition with a bit of delight of feeding. And speaking of loneliness, I created the Nara Baby Tracker because I found myself, taking care of my baby and recording everything. And I really wanted my partner and our village of caregivers to support me. And so I built a tracker where you could seamlessly add anybody to our app to help take care of your baby.
Very nice. And to create community as well, right? At the same time.
Create community. That's right.
So I love the segue of how we're all bringing our lenses to loneliness. Let's get into it. So I think we would all agree that there is a myth that you are not only expected to do it all, but you're expected to love it all, right? And we have a lot of research about where that comes from, traditional American values on motherhood, but also in things like our religions and how we talk about the role of mother. And it's sort of this saintly, perfect being, right, who does all these magical things and no one understands how she does them. And she does them with this all-knowing sense that I think most of us can acknowledge we have never had and don't expect to show up one day in our parenting. But this all-knowing sense that we'd have this gut or this instinct. And we see deeply rooted in some of our psychology is this idea that maternal instinct is meant to develop right at birth. And what's really interesting, and we always love the science because it can make you feel really good about things you already thought were true. But our science is changing to say, look, maybe that's not why parents experience changes in their brain at the moment of transition to parenthood, right? Maybe that's about keeping babies alive, because unlike other mammals, our children are born in need of care and feeding and attention. And maybe that's why we have some of those shifts in order to be able to be available and keep them alive, versus thinking about this sort of natural instinct where this foreign being who you've never met before would instantly be someone you feel super attached to or super safe with or super competent around. So I think our journey into loneliness and parental stress and anxiety starts with this romanticized vision of parenting. And when we talk to women in their third trimester, we try to talk about a realistic birth plan. I'm sure from Esther's perspective, you're talking about a lot about what to expect with feeding and what that's going to look like, a giant unknown that so many women are anxious about, and how is that going to go. And one thing we don't do a lot of talk about or enough about is really what are those first moments in that relationship? How do you get to know each other? What about when you don't get feedback? What about the months before your baby is smiling or laughing or cooing or giving you a lot? And that's where I think, as we're talking about today, a lot of this feeling of loneliness sort of originates. And as much as we can today, and for all of you to be ambassadors going forward, I think it's our hope that we can use that to sort of bust some of the myths about parenting as this romanticized journey that you're meant to love all the time. And I'll just say quickly that social media has never helped make that better. And we have a lot of data has made that worse, right? So pictures of loving, happy people all the time tend to make the people looking at them in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning feel pretty bad about themselves and pretty alone. So there's that. So I think what we want to focus on is that there is, of course, so much joy and love and wonderful things in the relationship of parenting, but it's balanced with a lot of hard moments and a lot of difficult choices, and a lot of vulnerability, right? For most of us, in that, for our first child at least, or sometimes even for our second and third, depending on their temperament and who we are at the time of their birth, this feels new. And although we know that that's a tremendous opportunity for growth and change and development, the newness makes us feel really anxious, and that contributes to loneliness. So we know that the way human beings work is that we learn in patterns. We form connections in our brain, and the more we repeat those connections stick around, right? That starts from the beginning of our development. And so thinking about things we can predict and routines we understand, parenting throws a huge wrench in all of that. And in that uncertainty is where we begin to try to control what we can't control. And that generally leads to that anxiety, potentially depression, that can help us spiral towards a place of loneliness. So in recent studies, we've seen that up to 32% of new parents say that they feel isolated, that they experience symptoms of loneliness. And again, this doesn't mean that this is all the time, that these are not mothers, as we've all admitted to having those feelings. These are not mothers who are not enjoying their baby, not delighting in moments with them, not building that connection. They're doing all of that, and they feel really lonely. One of the quotes we pulled when we were looking at this presentation was thinking of parenting as the busiest time you've ever felt alone, because you're actually never alone and you're constantly busy, but you always feel alone, right? And the jokes around the water cooler of adult conversations and what it's like to interact with somebody else when you've only been talking in parentese and you've been sportscasting and narrating your day, but you haven't connected with another person. How important is that? And what we're coming to learn is that those connections, those things that make us whole, are not only essential to who we are, but also to our ability to have that relationship with our children. So some of you may have read recently a study that was published on happiness, looking at adults long term in terms of what are some of the indicators around that. And one of the things that really stood out were connections to others. So we're going to get into later our practical strategies, but we sort of can't dismiss how important those connections are. Really quickly, we just want to distinguish between the loneliness we're talking about today and how it overlaps with postpartum anxiety and depression. So of course, baby blues, which over 80% of women experience after delivery, are the normal hormonal shifts in mood. There are a lot of the anxieties we all have in adjusting. I know if you're using a tracker and trying to stay on top of things and paying attention to everything, it doesn't mean you feel like you're competent in doing all of those things. And those are the shifts that we expect. And loneliness, I think, wrapped up in that. What we're talking about today is also how that shifts in your identity. And Erin's going to go into some of those changes and long-term finding your role again. It's different than the acute postpartum and depression and anxiety symptoms that we're happy to talk about later in this talk or in another talk or any other time. But we're sort of talking about more of the mood and adjustment issues rather than something clinical that we would be treated for. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Erin to get us into some of the signs of loneliness.
Thank you. So as Marielle was saying, there's a lot of research backing up that parents feel lonely, and it's moms and dads. And when we look across this, the only single study that has really delved in depth into loneliness, which I think says a lot in itself, because as parents, we can all say that this is a very valid concern and feeling that most of us have, but the research is just kind of catching up now, I think, to the practical. But in one of the largest studies that's been done on loneliness, more than 30% of parents reported feeling it. And I think what's interesting is in the United States, that percentage is actually a little higher. So we're looking at average here across 16 countries. In the US, it's slightly higher, and there's more variation between moms and dads in the US than any other place. So moms are expressing that they feel more lonely than dads are. And that is really amplified here in the US. And we can talk another time about why that may be and parental leave and whatnot, but just something I think for all of us to be aware of. So, when we think about general indications that we're feeling lonely, it's things like, I don't feel like myself. I don't feel like there's someone I can easily go to and they can fully empathize with what I'm going through. I kind of feel like my friends who don't have children don't really understand what I'm going through. And, even when I kind of want to reach out to people, I almost feel like I don't have the energy to do so. And I think, when we think about all these different themes, there's one big common theme among all of them, right? And that's this feeling of lacking intimate and authentic relationships, which makes us feel slightly unfulfilled. And that might be something that's very different from how we felt before being a parent, right? Because we had different priorities, different, time allocations, and that can be a major shift for all of us. And while we see these shifts, more among first-time parents, I think it should be noted that every time we add, an additional little person to our family, we see these shifts. They might not be quite as dramatic as the first time, but the second, the third, as Marielle was saying earlier, every transition, there's this point at which most parents report feeling a little lonely. So when we think about really, okay, why do we feel lonely, right? And that's, I think a lot of us want to figure out, okay, how do I figure out why I feel lonely? And then what do I do once I sort of have an idea of why I might feel lonely? So when we think about sort of these transitions around parenthood and why those transitions often result in feelings of loneliness, often think of both the sort of the physiological changes that occur, and that's where neuroscience is really lending a lot of information in terms of thinking about loneliness and why we feel that way, and as well as psychology. So when we think about the physiological changes that occur, there are a lot of studies now that are looking at brain scans and showing that the actual neural networks that we have pre-becoming a parent and post-becoming a parent. And it's not just gestational parents, right? So we're thinking about dads, adoptive parents, foster parents. A common theme among all parents is that there is a shift in how these networks are organized. And that shift is in such a way that it's really focused on social connections, and it's focused on how we attend to the baby. So that's why when a baby cries, right, a lot of us experience a different reaction to that postpartum than prepartum. And there's this physiological underlying reason for it, both in terms of how our brains are organized, as well as how our hormones are organized postpartum. And with those reorganizations, a lot of us, right, feel these changes. And And one of them, which I find to be so fascinating, is that between pre and postpartum, there's this rapid drop in things like progesterone and other sort of hormones that maybe sort of helped us attend to ourselves pre-parenting. And I should note, again, that's both gestational and non-gestational parents. So there's a larger drop post-birth among gestational parents. And the drop in some of these hormones is so great that it's now being equated to withdrawal. So, you know, if you're withdrawing from a substance, right, it's sort of expected that you might not feel your best. And now they're showing that there's such a large drop in hormones that it's not unexpected that we would feel different. So there's the hormonal basis, there's the neurological basis, and then there's the identity basis, right? So a lot of those things that defined us pre-parenthood, you know, religion, work, family, a lot of those dynamics shift, right? Whether it be how we consider, you know, religion in our lives or don't consider religion in our lives, how we, you know, think about our jobs. You know, a lot of us are thinking, do we want to go back to the same job we had beforehand? Do we want to go back to working outside of the home afterwards? And that in and of itself is a major shift in identity. And then there's also the family dynamic piece, right? We go from being often, you know, children, spouses, siblings, to then a parent, where your whole focus is, you know, supposed to be at the beginning, this little infant. And that in and of itself is a major jarring experience. And as Marielle was saying, along sort of these, you know, thinking about neurological changes, we're really shifting to think, okay, how do I keep this little one safe and secure? And a lot of the reason for that is because innately, we might not feel that way, right? So a recent study showed that interviewed mothers, 200, almost 200 mothers postpartum, a week postpartum, and they said, what was your first feeling when you held your baby? And they said ambivalence. And I think that says a lot, right? That it's not necessarily, and I can relate to that, that you felt this overwhelming sense of joy. You're kind of like, okay, I'm not really sure what I'm doing here. But then your body is kind of taking over to say, okay, you know what, you'll make this emotional connection at some point, but for now, we're just going to make sure that this little one stays alive. So all these changes come to sort of this, you know, volcano erupting where it's like, okay, I feel different. I am different when I think of the sort of my priorities. And that's where we see a lot of the loneliness come in.
Yeah.
So I think we're now going to talk a little bit about, so what do? We know that we're feeling this way. How can we support ourselves?
Yes. And one thing I think we also wanted to just touch on is the preoccupation we have with newborns, and how much, I think, Erin, you were looking at a study that moms were doing it, how much more they were on average 14 hours a day, and that was double the men,
Dad's
double the dads, of how much they were thinking about it. And I think, Esther, that totally connects with you with the app and speaking to like the need to know and track and be part of a community and caregivers, and like that is a constant thought. And I know we're not getting into all where that comes from, but I think we've redefined, you know, in the last 2 generations, we've redefined what it is to be a parent and what it is to be a mom, and we've upped the stakes on our expectations of what we can do, and somehow done that while we've diminished the community and the supports around you to do it. So it's a really interesting push-pull, right? Between we expect more of ourselves, we think about our children all the time, we're meant to think about our children in every single choice we make, and we feel like the stakes are so high for what we do, and yet we have so many fewer resources and people around to do it. So,
which the whole resources thing, I think, you know, I like going back in the science. I just feel comfortable with that's my personality type, but the science is really showing too how we're not really meant to parent alone. You know, thinking about this sort of neural reorganization that occurs among primary caretakers, parents, that same neurological shift is also seen in grandparents who have a role in raising their grandchildren. And I think, you know, that's to me such a powerful message that the biological shift that we go through as parents is also seen among grandparents and non-biologically related primary caregivers. So there is this underpinning that we're probably not necessarily meant to do this on our own, even though that is a situation for many of us.
sure. Esther, I don't know if you wanted to jump in with anything here now from your perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the Nara baby tracker, we actually added mom tracking, that where the data is not accessible by your partner or your caregiver, is really for you. And the reason why we built that in is really so that we could take space to take care of ourselves, just because, when you become a new parent, a new mom, you're taking care of a baby, but who's taking care of you? Like, who's making sure that you're drinking enough water and that you're sleeping enough? So we've built in a very specific mom tracker feature so that you could take care of everything from hydration to diet to sleep. And at the same time, keeping track of your mood. So when you do start building a village around you of postpartum caregivers who take care of you, that you're understanding how you're running so that you could feed that data back and have other people take care of you. So I think it's important for us to as caregivers, not just take care of our babies, but also take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
I love that's part of the tracker as well, just that own self-awareness, because, there's so much research as well as anecdotal evidence of knowing where you are is so important in order to figure out what you need in the moment. And so often we don't know where we are, right? Because unless somebody or something is asking us to say, how are you in this moment? We often don't think about it.
I love that we're
That's
using
right.
the word awareness, because I have such a beef with the self-care thing, because it sounds so luxurious when it's like, I'm going to do something about it. I know how to fix it, versus just also being aware of it, right? I'm not sleeping well. I'm not taking care of myself. I don't feel like myself. And sometimes we don't have to have the answer to identify what it is. So if you walk away from this talk feeling like I am lonely, there are moments I feel really lonely, that's a win, because when we bring awareness to something, then we can start to think, and then our minds shift into thinking what we could do about it. But sometimes we're just going through the motions. Who has time to even do a sort of head to toe assessment of how we feel? Feel is off to the side.
And that's what they say is why meditation can be so effective. Just being aware of what's going on within, just only that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I want to have the tracker on my phone. Even I have a 2-year-old, so we'll have to talk about where you age out.
Right. It depends what you're tracking, I guess. We'll have to figure out the things that we can look at. Okay, so I think we've touched a little bit about building our own village. I think, one thing we want to say is that your village does not need to be traditional. I think it's not helpful to tell people based on your family dynamics and what's going on with you, like, go and find supportive grandparents. If you don't have parents who are going to be involved or who can play that role, or mine were never in the sort of health and position to be caregivers, that's okay. You can throw out that notion of it and say, my village is my group of friends. My village is my community on Cooper, in my Coop group. My village are, other parents at the daycare center that I'm using, and have this sort of broad definition of who can be in your village. And we have a lot of data that people in non-traditional roles play a really significant part of our well-being. So, whether it's research on the janitor asking how kids are feeling when he sees them alone in the hallway being a means to prevent suicide, right? We understand that people checking on you, people in your world, just makes it better. And so whenever you can think of who is that village, where are those people, what are my touch points, and not instead, sort of have that romanticized version of the village the way you had about parenting.
I think that's such a good point too, because it can be hard when you have that romanticized image and you don't have that romanticized village, that then you start to maybe resent those who are not in your village. And that has its own slew of negative correlations. Speaking from someone who also did not have grandparents that were.
But we get a lot of questions. Erin and I both get a lot of questions around attachment to nannies, to other caregivers. Is that harmful? Does it take away from the mom? Working mothers are always worried that they're giving something up if they allow their child to have that relationship. And instead of that, if you view them as part of your village, as they're an extension of you, they're doing things in the way that builds that, it can be such a positive, instead of feeling like it's always taking something away from you. Willingness to seek help. So as we said, awareness is the first thing, but in as a society, if we could reframe that asking for and finding yourself help was a strength, not a weakness, it would be such a gift across the board. But I think as a community together, if we can come together as parents and say that there is help that's available, but only if we make it okay to ask for it. And what is that shift if we say that asking for and seeking it is a positive, is a strength, and it comes from a strength based place. I think that we all acknowledge there are really good resources out there that can be sort of an answer to it, but not if we're not open to them, and if there's any shame or guilt around them.
It was interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's a clinical psychologist the other day, and she was saying, in all her research and all her work, she always finds that the best thing that a parent can do is to be a healthy, happy parent. It's, so many of us come, right, thinking like, what can I do to help my child in terms of like providing supports for my child? And she's like, if you really look at the research and, it's sort of anecdotal evidence from clinicians and teachers, it's really having a happy, healthy primary caregivers that is the best predictor for children's ultimate happiness. So good point.
So then we have reducing pressure. This is a tough one, but if there, again, as we mentioned, we have this shift right now in our society and different demands on parents. A survey done of millennial parents was the first time that parents answered that they did believe there was a perfect way to parent, right? Which we know there is not, but that there is that feeling that there is some perfect way. So I think practically speaking, what we would say is take away from this talk, or for anybody that telling them, is there one thing you could remove from your plate? Is there one thing you could let go of? Is there one thing you could care about just a little bit less in a way that would free up that pressure from yourself? And sometimes we have to, as Erin was talking about identity, we have to separate what feels really important to do because it's who we actually are, and what feels really important to do for this imaginary role as a mom. So if you're getting into that sort of martyr mentality where you're like, moms never get tired of putting their babies to bed, then that's something we got to let go of. If that's not true for you, I feel thrilled if someone else wants to put my children to bed. So I'm here to tell you, if that's what you want to let go, let it go. If there's a conception in your mind about what a mom would do, what a dad would do, and that's not who you want to be, can you take that off your plate and relieve yourself of some of that pressure? And going back to your village, can you find other people who make you feel supported in doing that, right? So can you join a community where it's totally okay to say, you know what, I'm not doing any of those things that traditionally we've put on a poster as like the good mom sort of, I don't know. I don't know who the poster child would be for the good mom. She's somebody, but I don't know her.
I'm just smiling and laughing because as a mom of a 2-year-old, let it go. I'm like, okay, Elsa, let it go. That's another conversation, but
listen, I feel like Disney has provided lots of parenting nuggets, but I'm not sure about parenting advice on all of them. But that one we can totally go.
Let it go.
Let it go. Oh yeah, go.
Oh, sorry. Just what's resonating with me too when you were talking about pressure and now expectations as well is just social media, and that's probably a larger conversation to have, but it can be wonderful. It can be a source of community, but also if you find that sometimes it puts pressure on you to be a certain type of parent and it's not allowing you to put realistic expectations on yourself as a parent, it's okay to let it go.
Totally. And that all ties into realistic expectations of yourself, of those around you, of your ability. And I mean, for all things, we would do ourselves a sort of service if we could have a more realistic appraisal of things going on and understanding, and then expectations of ourselves, right? So I think that connects with everything else. Anything else you want to say on that, Erin, around?
No, I think that's perfect.
Okay. And then boundaries. So I think boundaries being a new subject to kind of touch in on is like, how are you, for those of you who are in, and by the way, we didn't say to put questions in chat and I can't see chat while we're presenting, but I hope you're putting questions in chat because we'd love to get into any and all. We've saved a lot of time for questions, so please throw them in there. But one we usually get is around boundaries, is like, part of why I feel lonely is because I'm also parenting with other people's influence, with other people telling me what they think I should say and do, with all of these other sort of competing agendas around childcare. And how do I balance that? And how do I get some healthy boundaries? And well, that's an ongoing answer.
Ongoing answer. And I think too, I think you and I were talking about this at one assembly, but figuring out like where your boundaries are. So, when let's say the grandparents taking care of your kids and, maybe they allow them to watch too much TV, like, I experienced, it's like figuring out, okay, is that like a boundary that matters a lot to me? Or is that something that maybe I can, let it go for the time being because I want them to spend time with their grandparents. So, all these things, right? Just figuring out sort of what are the boundaries that maybe have a little flexibility and what are the ones that we are not going to budge on.
Yeah. And even small things like I can't do middle of the night feeds because if I don't sleep, I don't function well the next day. And so that is a boundary I have to have, that I have to, I give myself permission to figure out something else to do. Or this makes me really uncomfortable when this happens. And so I have to try to find something else to alleviate that moment that's really difficult for me. So I think we always we tend to think of boundaries as a negative, and then healthy boundaries as being like, I'm protecting myself. And I think really it is part of just not necessarily protecting, but advocating for yourself, figuring out what really matters to you and revising them constantly. As a parent, things are changing every week sometimes in terms of what's really important, what's top of mind. And so revising what really matters to you and where those boundaries are going to be with this sort of freshness you can bring to it along the way. Then you have to have new opportunities. So you definitely have to get on the tracker so that you can meet your community there. You definitely have to join a Coop group so you can meet your community there. And you have to find other and more social outlets wherever those may be. And I think in terms of suggestions we make, it's definitely the virtual community has made it easier to find people. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Sometimes it's so hard to have a barrier of even getting dressed to go somewhere to meet people. But meeting other parents through the activities you're doing with your children, as much as you can, and meeting other parents who parent similarly to you or have something in common with you can be a good place to start. That's one of the reasons we feel really passionately at Cooper about matching you with criteria that matter to you. Because necessarily if I'm in one, I'm trying to think of the postpartum rooms where the curtain is down the middle, and just because I'm in the A bed and you're in the B bed and we had the baby on the same day does not mean that we are going to necessarily get along or love each other. And a lot of our parent stuff is organized just by birthday. So the idea to be able to think about connecting on something deeper or something more important to your family.
I love that example. Like, just because you had a baby on the same day doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have this amazing connection. It might, but it doesn't necessarily mean it.
Sure, there's something you can learn from each other anyway, but might not be a connection.
Exactly.
And then the last thing is, of course, like, we want everyone to know how much we believe in therapy and other treatment if it's necessary. We have so much good data. Again, as Erin said, that taking care of you and how you're doing is not only essential for your health, but really for your baby. So if we can't convince you that you should do it so that you can feel better, really your health and wellness and your ability to then be present and connect and be the parent that you want to be really impacts your child. So again, if you can't do it for yourself, think about it for the impact on your child.
Definitely.
And I think that takes us to questions. I'm going to stop sharing for a second in my technical. I know we got some questions in advance before, but if anybody has any, unmute yourself, throw them in chat. We love a try to stump us, give us a tough one, whatever it is. Thoughts, feelings. Okay, Erin, I'm going to go to some of the ones we got in advance, and I'm going to put you on the spot with some of those.
I'm going to put you on a spot of one that I just thought of for my own family.
Oh, goodness. Okay, you go first.
Want to hear it? Okay.
Yeah, I'm ready.
So I would say that my spouse felt more lonely than I did after having a child. How would you recommend supporting your partner if you feel like they might be struggling?
Such a good question. Such a good question. And what I love about it is that we are like so often referred to as the gatekeepers around our
Mhm.
babies in the beginning, right? And a mother's job to sort of like be the mama bear and keep everybody away and get super organized and take care of everything can be so isolating to a partner who wants to be involved. And so like I'm projecting onto Kevin that like in his loneliness is part of like, where do I fit in here? And where do I fit in with this family that I'm seeing, this like dyad that's coming together and bonding, and what do I do on the outside? And so like some of the really practical things we try to say are definitely to the mom. We would say like, let's make a little room, because again, if he doesn't change a diaper the right way and you don't let him practice, he'll never change a diaper the right way. And if he doesn't do it exactly the way you do it, your baby may learn a new way that things can be done and really love it, right? So some really good things come out of that. And if it feels better, then you can train him if you let him do it. Whatever the mentality has to be, he has to have a chance to participate. So there's that definitely, I would say to you, Erin, let him in.
Thank you.
And then
You're
to
not just projecting onto him, by the way. I think there's some projection onto me with this whole thing.
just a little, just a little. I'm just using you as a larger example. You don't have to live up to it. And then I think for the partners, it's like jump in and find things. I think as community, when I watch my friends, my loved ones have babies, I think, yeah, there's the wait to be asked and give them space and respect them, but also when you know what they need help doing, it's okay to just help, right? And people asking and then not receiving an answer back from text, like, you can drop something off or you can try to take care of something needs done. And I think for partners, it's the same. Moms who are breastfeeding still need a diaper changed afterwards. You can be the diaper changer if you can't help with the feeding. If mom is doing bath time because that's really important to her, who's getting the baby dressed afterwards? And so there are a million little tasks in there that I think become like, how can we delegate? And there's again, as you know, there's so much interesting research on that, like mental burden of just like, I'm holding all these things that need to get done and I don't know how to share them with anyone. And the more conversations we can have when you say, hey, I'm holding all these things and I don't know what to do with all of them, and they sound ridiculous, but here's a list of all the stuff that's running through my head, which ones can you take? And that's a lesson forever for parents, I think, which is like, what can you take? I don't know. I made a joke about making lunches for kids. Like, is there an assumption that I would be good at that because I had children? Like, I'm a terrible cook. If anybody was thinking of coming over for dinner, I'll order in, it'll be fine. But I'm a terrible cook. I don't enjoy it. It stresses me out. I look at what they didn't eat after I spent the time to do it. It just makes me nuts. And so I think that's one of those things where like, can I just say to my husband, why does this have to be me? Like, where did this assumption come that it would be me? Can this be you? And sometimes just opening that up really changes the whole conversation. I don't know if that was helpful, but
It was very helpful. And it relates, I think, to a couple of the questions we've gotten in chat. So an example of how to just start up a conversation with another parent. How can you form a group? Great question.
Great question. So, well, on Cooper, we'll form the group for you if you don't have anyone to join with you, or you can invite a friend to join with you and say, do you want to try this, parent group with me? How to start a conversation with a parent. I don't know, Erin, you're so social and good at doing that. I think you find, well, listen, I'd give you the same thing I give parents about how to start friends, right?
Yeah.
If you've ever wondered why someone says to you like, oh, I like your shirt. Compliments work really well on humans and we tend to use them. And we even see little kids, again, this is where kids are amazing. We even see little kids do the same thing. Like if you're wearing a, Giants jersey and I like the Giants, we must be best friends, right? That kind of assumption that like finding something in common or starting with a compliment as a way to go. But maybe it's about a product they're using that you notice with their baby, or a gripe on something else that's good. There's always a gripe that you can have in common, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like I found at least when, my kids were little, really little, it was like, oh, how old is, your baby? My baby's 6 months. I'm having a hard time sleeping. Are you as tired as I am?
Oh, tired. The
Tired.
universal gripe that you can use at any age.
And whether you have kids or not.
Also true. Also true. Moving to a new neighborhood, where are the new parents? It's hard depending on the age of your child. Like if you're not playground age, then obviously that's not going to work. If there's a baby class, so I don't know if you would agree with me, Erin. I think a music class is a great way to start
Mhm.
super young when there's no expectation that they have to do a lot to participate and they can be just, little itty bitty babies. That might be a way you find other parents, depending on the time of day. So I just want to flag this for working parents. I always found it was like middle of the day classes were a lot of nannies, and it was very hard for me to
Yeah.
meet people that way. And so doing something that was weekends did a lot of good for me. It also was really great for partners because it's another thing where you can say, like, I signed up, our baby for this class, and you're going to take them to that class. And then I'm going to do something else, or a talk series, or something that's being offered at my community center or a religious affiliation, I'm going to do. Right. And so you can kind of divide and conquer. Um, and again, come to Cooper and we'll find you parents. They don't have to live in your neighborhood because of Zoom, which is amazing. Erin and I live on other coasts and we work together every day. So it's always possible.
Totally. And starting a new conversation with a new parent, Erin, I'm an Erin. So I love your question in chat. No, I, I definitely I felt that a little bit from my spouse, and it's something that comes up a lot with parents that I work with is this, you know, resentment or difficulty because they have to go to work and leave the baby or, the kids. And how do you balance that? It's also hard to be at home, right? Like, that has its own challenges in and of itself, and how you sort of come to the same page when you're thinking about what you both need and what your child needs. And I feel like that could be very challenging at times. I don't know. What do you think, Marielle?
Very challenging. And again, I feel like it's one of those things where there are so many invisible tasks that, a partner can't see. That when we make visible, we have the hope of, maybe uncovering some of it. I think there's an interesting studies about, moms who are stay at home full time and moms who work, about the quality time they're actually spending with their children. And, I don't know, you're not going to present your husband with research necessarily like Erin and I do for our spouses, but moms who are staying at home are doing as many other things that are not related to time with their child, that they may end up with the same amount of quality time as a mother who wasn't there all day and then is coming home for that quality time, right? Because there's a million other things to do. So it shouldn't be a mystery that it's not all like we're going to play together, laughing in delight on the play mat. But if it is, how can you expose some of the other stuff that is there? And then, make a value judgment together. Say, like, housework is insane and it's piling up, and I don't want to do it. And if I want to be present for the baby, it's hard for me to do it. And I can't do it because I'm at work. Okay, is that something we can delegate? Is that something we can give away? Can we live with a messier house during this time? Can we have different expectations about cooking dinner if we're home taking care of a baby? And again, maybe there's just some things you can eliminate. Um, a baby, sometimes I say, and I like to use these like strange things that stick in your mind, but like a baby's not like a purse. Like you didn't just like add something to the rest of your life and then it's like I tote them around and they're adorable. They're going to disrupt everything. And so if you're still trying to hold on to like our life is basically the same except we come home and there's this little purse that we got in the corner, I think that's where a lot of that disconnect can lie. And maybe some of that, what your partner's experiencing is just like, I thought things would only change in this one little area, and instead it's kind of across the board.
I think what can also be hard if you're the partner who's not around as much is that, kids go through this phase, right? That maybe they appear to be more connected to the parent who's around more, and that can feel hard for the other parent. So also just like having an honest and open conversation about, okay, I know that this can be really hard because, Amy seems like she always goes to me, but that's natural. And that's a good thing, right? Like we were talking about before, like multiple attachments, having a really healthy primary attachment is a great thing. It means that they will have more secure and healthy attachments and relationships with others. So sort of making it seem like, or not seem, but laying out that this is a good thing in the long run, even though in the moment it can seem really hard.
And then sometimes it's the opposite, where you're doing all the work for the baby, staying home all day, and then the other
Totally.
person comes in and it's like a celebrity sighting. And then it's just like, well, gee, thanks. I'm the one who did all the scut work. But we have to do a whole nother talk on parental preference, because that just makes everybody feel bad about everything. There's no good that comes from parental preference, I think. Um, we have a question about struggling with setting boundaries with extended family. Oh, me too. First grandbaby, how do you handle family members who visibly show and make comments about how they only care about your child and could care less about you? Oh, I'm so sorry that you're having that experience. It makes me want to keep them from seeing your baby. Yeah, I get that. I get that. You know, it's sometimes relationships can't be repaired between you and other adults, for sure. I think we all can acknowledge that. I think it's whether or not they can have a relationship with your baby, with your child, that is separate from that. So I get asked a lot about explaining to our children about difficult relationships where we don't get along with our dad, but they're going to be a grandfather in that relationship. And how can we talk about that? I think for you and your own mental health, you have to find a place where you're not listening to that and having to absorb and deal with it and work on how to not respond to it, because that feels like that would be a really tall order for you. But maybe it's something like when they spend time together, you're not the one who supervises that, or your partner does that, or you step out so that they can have that quality moment. And the idea of, can they have a relationship with your child that doesn't have to involve you if it's not going well? Um, to the boundary question, I think, it can't be about everything so quickly. When we don't parent the same way as somebody else, we make a boundary about everything, a rule about everything. In one of my coop groups last night, we were talking about, my mother goes to my baby so quickly when she fusses, right? And this mom was telling me, mom and dad were telling me about how they wanted a little bit of time for the baby to fuss, to figure it out, to see if she would be okay, to see if she could calm herself. And they know that's important. And we talked about that in group, but their mother just won't listen to it. And they were like, we're going to write down instructions that say, count to 25 before you go to the baby. And I'm thinking, like, I can't see how that's going to go over well, right? So we sort of tried to amend it to say, can I explain why this is really important to me? Why I learned that it is important for her to fuss a little bit by herself to see if she can calm herself. And if I explain that to my mother, then would she be willing to take 25 seconds? Then can I say, one way we could try this is we could count to 25 in that way, with some thinking, right? The way we might explain to a child about why they can't hit somebody, right? Like, you have that feeling, what can we do about it instead? So that it doesn't come like an instruction. I don't know, Erin, about your mother-in-law. Mine would not take kindly to count to 25 before you go to the baby. That would
No.
I'm not sure that would go over.
It would just add to her list of reasons. Yeah. But I want to go back to a point that you made that I think is really good. And I'm thinking about my in-laws right now, is that, having the baby and the grandparents have time when you're not there. That would have been really hard for me with my firstborn, right? Because it's like such a change, and you want to make sure like the entire environment for them is amazing, right? And if you're not there, it's hard to know. But can you talk a little bit more about that? Because, at the same time, you have all this research saying how important it is for, if it's an option for children to have their grandparents involved. So like, how do you strike that of like, I want my children to have a relationship with their grandparents, but at the same time, I don't feel so good in the relationship I have with their grandparents. Like, where is there that balance, right? When we're talking about boundaries of figuring out how they can have a relationship, but you can also not feel so bad every time that you're around them.
Yeah. Well, by no means do I have all the answers, but I think like I've learned for myself, like, family time doesn't always mean we're all together. And I do a lot better with some family members when I leave my kids with them and I'm not there. And again, maybe I'm just in the other room. So when my first was younger, I definitely would have just gone in the other room and been like, I'm going to use this as a chance to take a nap. Now, this is assuming, of course, this is not somebody, just I feel like I have to say as a disclaimer, not somebody that you feel like the baby's unsafe with, or that there's any risk to them in terms of their safety, or to you in terms of the safety of having them, in which case, if it's like a safety concern, I think there's absolutely no reason you have to introduce them to your life or your baby's life if you feel like you can't feel confident in that. But maybe I would say, look, that my baby's fed, my baby is dry, grandma's here, and it goes better if I leave grandma to hold and say the things that drive me nuts to the baby, and read the stories or listen to the music that I can't stand, and I go and take a nap, or I go call a friend that I haven't talked to in forever, because I can never find, still to this day, my kids are 11 and 8, and I don't know when I'm supposed to call my friends. But I could do that in the other room. I think, again, being able to do that can really make it easier for them to develop that relationship. Or saying, I did a lot of like, can you do pickup? And it's yours, and you walk home together, and you talk about whatever, and you coo with the baby, and you have that whole experience. And then when you get to the house, it's back to being mine. And so little moments like that I think over time add to, like, my kids will, go out to dinner with their grandparents, and I don't have to go. And that's not what family time means. Now, if they're traveling and visiting, there's all kinds of different layers to it. But I don't know if I answered your
Very
question.
helpful.
I think
Definitely did. Yeah.
okay. We definitely have freaking out about milestones. Oh, milestones.
So hard. And they've been revised, by the way.
They've been revised to be even broader.
Yep.
Listen, we need milestones to exist because we have to track children, and we have to have our pediatricians and family medicine doctors have ways to look at the trajectory of a child's development. But no single milestone on its own is something that, if I could, I would just have parents not think about them and look more for the other signs of development that we know are so much more important, right? And I love, somebody told me something really interesting about like the points on a curve, right? And when you think about achieving milestones and getting there, you need lots of points in time to see which way this is going. And so any one moment, any one visit is really impossible to say, this is something I'm super worried about. This is something that's really off. This is something that's not okay. For the most part, what we're doing is looking at patterns over time, and development just doesn't happen on a schedule or a timetable. And your second part of that question, in the parent competition, is just like nonsense. Competitive parenting is a sport that, we don't, we would love for all of you to avoid engaging in.
I'd also add that, milestones are very different. Like there's physical milestones, there's verbal milestones, there's emotional milestones. So, some people, we all know, even as adults, some of us are more physical, some of us are more verbal, some of us are more emotional. So it doesn't matter. You can't really, so it's really difficult to, I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't compare your child to the blanket statement of developmental milestones, because you might have a little football player who's going to crawl and walk faster than everyone else. Or you might have a little orator who is going to be chatty and be very early with speech. And so trying to remember that not all developmental milestones are the same.
Totally. And as somebody who teaches statistics, it's all about averages, right? And like standard deviations, and milestones are based on, quote unquote, the sort of average mean, point in time, like you're saying, that a child does things. But there's so much variation that's all within a very healthy range that we often don't talk about. So sorry, we're doing these quickly because we're noticing the time, but you can also email us, right?
Email us anytime. The last thing I'll say on milestones is that so few of them depend on parents exposing their children to other things. So like, again, join a COOP group so we can talk about the things parents can control, and then the things you can't control about development. So the idea that it was competitive implies you could have done it. More patience. I think we'll end on that last question. Oof, Erin, more patience around crying babies and that adjustment. It's tough. It takes time.
It takes so much time. As someone, I feel like I could relate to you, Catherine. My husband was somewhat similar, and whatever. It's such a big conversation, but there's like so many reasons that we feel this way around crying, and sort of trying to figure out the root of how we feel, where it's biological, psychological. But it can be very, very challenging. And I think, again, going back to all these different conversations we've had about boundaries and, figuring out sort of how to protect ourselves, is if, the crying is really hard, like if you can figure out a way that maybe he does something else that doesn't involve crying, and has that time. And then you're the one who is more, the crying person for a little time until he probably, just comes a little around to a little more patience around it. Could be one way to deal with it. But this is such a big conversation, and I hate
Such a big, it's hard to end on that note, but
Yes.
we definitely have more to say about crying and all of these topics. And Esther, I don't know if you can throw in chat. Oh, you got it. All right.
Done.
She's already on it with the Nara. So we hope that, yes, email us. We'll get you involved in Cooper, and at whatever that involvement means, we'll take your questions anytime. So please email us anyway. I'm Marielle at Your Cooper. This lady is Erin at Your Cooper.
Pretty easy.
Please reach out to us. You'll get a follow-up for attending today, and that will have all of our information on Nara Organics and on Cooper. And we hope we see you in a group or at a talk soon. And thank you for having us. Oh, good. We all have very straightforward email addresses. So you just only have to remember our name, and then you can find us. Thank you guys all so much. Thank you, Esther, for doing this with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.